Cascading style sheets. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. We'll be using a combination of HTML and CSS to create websites. CSS is a markup language just like HTML, and it lets us control how a web page looks. This is an example of an HTML page, and it's just to show you how there is a link to a style.css file within the head element. So the head element contains the title element, the meta element, and if there's a link to a CSS file, that link happens inside of the head element. What is the reason for which the style.css page should exist in the first place? That's because if we want to control the styling properties of what we see on the web page. For example, in this case, we have a table with 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. Perhaps we want the table to be blue. Maybe we want the words to be underlined, and so on. We control all of these styling properties in the style.css file. How do we access elements in CSS? By element. So in the CSS file, we write P. For example, if the element were P for paragraph, we open close curly braces and we write the properties inside of the curly braces, such as color, colon, a hexadecimal value, semicolon, for example. Same thing for div, open close curly braces and write the properties inside of the curly braces, span, and so on. We can also access elements in CSS by ID. So if an element has an ID, for example, if a P has an ID container, or if a div has an ID header, we can access elements by ID, and obviously the pound sign represents the ID. The dot sign represents class, so we can access the elements in CSS by class. We say li.items, and items is the value of the class. Footer is the value of the class of the div element. We can also access elements in CSS if they're nested. So in this case, we see div and then a space, div pound container. Here we see div pound footer space p pound first. What does this space mean? Whenever we see the space, it means that the element that comes next is nested or is the child of the element before it. So in this case, the div whose ID is container is the child of div. In this example, the P whose ID is first is the child of a div whose ID is footer. So this space means that the element that's coming next is the child of the element that's before it. In other words, let's say we have this syntax. In HTML, li class container, so the value of the class is container. The way we reference this in CSS is li.container. And open close curly braces include all the styling properties within the curling braces. Note that we can also say li, only li, in CSS. We don't need to say li.container. But what happens then? If we just say li and open close curly braces, then all of the li's in the HTML will be affected by those properties. But what if we only want a specific li to be blue, for example? That's why we use classes and IDs just to target the specific elements that we want and not everything else on the page. So li is the element, the dot references elements by class, and the container happens to be the class name or the value. Same example, but if the li had an ID. li ID container. We reference the li in CSS with the pound sign, obviously, because the attribute is an ID. So li pound container, and we include all the properties within the curly braces. Another example. Let's say we have an li, or a list if you will, whose class is container. It is nesting an A. How do we know it's nesting? Always remember that an element is nesting another element if it closes after that element. So Li opens right here and it closes in the end. Before it closes, there's an A element that opens and closes. The A element has an attribute href and it's linking to a URL msu.edu. So how is this referenced in CSS if we're targeting the A? If we're targeting the A, what we do in CSS is basically say li.container space A. And then we include the properties within the curly braces, such as text decoration underline, which will go ahead and put an underline under the word. For example, the word MSU, which is supposed to link to msu.edu. Li is the element, the dot. Container happens to be the class name or the value. The space is basically referring that A is nested inside of the Li, and A is the element which is basically nested inside of the Li. Let's look at this example. We have a div whose class is container and whose ID is stopbox. It is nesting an h1 that has the word hello. There's another div that has the same class container and a different ID middle box, which is also nesting an h1 that has the word hello. We have a third div that has the same class container, a different ID bottom box. It is also nesting an h1 that has the word hello. So let's look at the CSS now. The CSS property here is basically saying that the h1 that is nested because of the space, right? The h1 that is nested in a div whose class is container, we want that h1 to have a font size of 12 pixels. So the question is, which of the h1s will have a font size of 12 pixels? We go and look at the HTML and we realize that we have 3 divs that have the same class. So if we want the h1 that is nested in the div whose class is container to be 12 pixels, then all of the h1s, in other words, the 3 words hello, will have a font size of 12 pixels. As opposed to this property, if we have this property in CSS, then first let me define it. It's saying that we want the h1 that is nested in the div whose ID is stopbox to have a font size of 16 pixels. The question is, which of the h1s will have a font size of 16 pixels? So, what do we do now? Basically, the only h1 that is nested in a div whose ID is stopbox is the first one, because the other ones, the other divs, have different IDs. Remember that an ID has a unique value. We never repeat the same value twice on an HTML page. So, in other words, the last 2 hello words will be 12 pixels, but only the first word hello will become 16 pixels, and that's because the h1 that is nested in the div whose ID is stopbox should have a font size of 16 pixels. That's what's written in the CSS. Let's look at the next example. Represent the following CSS in HTML. Okay, so if we have div.container space span pound top box open close curly braces, how is this written in HTML? So before looking at the video, try to solve it yourself. How is the HTML of this syntax in CSS? So let me go ahead and do it for you, but really actually try to do it yourself before watching the video. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and explain it in English, if you will, before going ahead. So this is saying there's a div whose class is container. It is nesting, because of the space, a span whose ID is stopbox. Okay, so let me write that in HTML. There's a div, so I open the div element and then I close it. Okay, every time you open an element, close it unless it is self-closing, like the image element or the meta element and so forth. So there's a div whose class is container. Let me first insert some space. It has a class container, which means space class equals container. Okay, so element space attribute equals value. That's how we write it. Div space class equals container. That div is nesting a span. Okay, if it's nesting, the first thing I need to think about is that the span should be inside the div, which means it should be before the div closes. That's why I have the space here. That's the first thing I have to plan out. The second thing is indentation. So we said earlier that when an element is the child of another element, then we indent so that visually it's easy for us to see what is the child of what. So span, open the span, close the span element. Okay, you can also do this. Open the span and close the span on the next line. Okay, span whose ID is top box. So element, the span is the element, space, attribute. The attribute is the ID. How do I know that? Because I see the pound sign. How did I know that I should put class here? Because I saw a dot, right? So span space ID equals top box. That's it. So we have a div whose class is container. It is nesting a span whose ID is top box. Let's look at this example now. Is this how the below CSS is written in HTML? On the left side, we have the CSS, which says that there's a div whose class is container, which is nesting another div whose ID is top box, which is in turn nesting an H1. The HTML is saying there's a div whose class is container and whose ID is top box. It is nesting an H1. So if you take a moment and look at this, the answer to this question, is this how the below CSS is written in HTML, is no. It is false. This is wrong. Let's write the proper one. I'm going to take this and write properly. So there's a div whose class is container. Let me go ahead and type that. The minute you open an element, close it. Otherwise you will forget unless it's a self-closing element like the image element, for example. So div class container, div space class is container. Again, remember, I know that it should be a class, not an ID, because I see the dot sign here. The div class container is nesting, because there's a space here, another div. So if it's nesting, what I need to do is insert the second div before my initial div closes. So I hit enter and I indent. Okay? The indentation will show me that there's a child here. So another div, close that div, and that div has an ID top box. I know it's an ID because of the pound sign, so space ID is top box, and in turn div top box is nesting an H1. So again, what do? I hit enter and indent, and I open my H1 and close my H1. That's it. And if the H1 has the word hello, for example, or whatever, I just include it there. Okay.